Hello everyone, it's Jen Kramer, and this week we are going to talk about relative positioning. Last week we talked about absolute positioning. Be sure to take a look at that video in the description below where I have linked to it. There will talk about the HTML, the CSS, where this example came from. This is what we coded last week. This is an absolutely positioned set of cards from the upper left-hand corner of the web page. This week we're going to talk about relative positioning by way of first talking about or reviewing static positioning. So remember that these items up here in the upper left-hand corner that looks like a bunch of purple lines, those are a series of borders that were around a div of placeholder. This is the space that the cards used to occupy. One of the defining characteristics of absolute positioning is that the absolutely positioned element, in this case these cards, are pulled out of the normal flow, and the space that they used to occupy collapses to nothing, which is why we just have a stack of borders there in the corner of the page. When I change this back to static, that's the only change I'm making to this code, you'll see actually where we started from in this example, where we have the cards stacked on top of each other, 3, 1, 5, 2, and 4. And you'll notice that the cards themselves, which have a z-index and a left and a top property assigned to them, all of that is ignored. That is because z-index, left, and top are only relevant if we are working with positioning and the value happens to be absolute, relative, sticky, or fixed. Z-index works in a couple of other environments like grid, but we're not going to go there for right now. It definitely doesn't work in the static environment. So what happens now if I change this to relative? So only one change. What happens and why? Well, in static, we did not have to pay attention to left, top, or z-index. Now that we have this change that has occurred, we do have to pay attention to it. So let's just pick on number 3 since it's the first one here. Card number 3 is styled to be 20 pixels from the left, 20 pixels from the top. That is in fact where it is in space. And it is at a z-index in this case of 3, which has a higher z-index than 1, and it overlaps the 2. But card number 1 had a position of 0, 0, right? So z-index of 1, left and top of 0 pixels. But it looks like it hasn't moved. What's going on there? Well, the question is, relative to what? Ha ha ha. So in the case of absolute positioning, if we looked at our HTML document, we looked at all of the relationships between all of the zillions of divs here on this page, we would work our way up from the card through all of those divs up to the body tag. And if any of those divs along the way had a position property set to a value of something other than static, then we would have had our absolute positioning based on that particular part of the HTML. We didn't have that, so we shoved them all up into the upper left-hand corner. With relative positioning, it's always relative. And so what happens here is that the cards have the declaration of position relative on them, and they are positioned relative to their parent, which in this case is the placeholder. So you'll notice that each one of these cards has, in fact, the left and top properties set up exactly as we had said, 10, 20, 30, 40 pixels away from each of those, but they are away from the top left corner of the placeholder, not the top left corner of the web page. And that's why they look the way they look. We can rearrange these in space simply by changing the value of left and top. In order to move things up on the page, we could use a negative value for left. A negative value for top to move those up on the page. We'll move them up in space. So just to show you what that looks like, if we took card number 1 here and we said negative 100 pixels, that will move, whoops, and that was on the wrong one. Let's put it on the top. Negative 100 pixels, that will move that card up in space. And it doesn't quite get you there because we have to take into account some of the borders that we encounter along the way that number actually winds up being negative 108 in order to get it all the way up to the top of the page. And likewise, to get it all the way over to the left, we have some borders in the way, adds up to another 4 pixels or so of space. So we need to say negative 4 pixels in order to shove that left card up into that corner of the web page. So we could still generate a series of fanned out cards. It would take a lot of math to do it, and we would have a lot of space that would still be here on the page unoccupied because that space is held open. Okay, so that is relative positioning in a nutshell. Let's look at where relative positioning actually makes more sense than this type of thing here. And that is determining where absolute positioning might happen on your particular web page. So in this second example, linked to the CodePen as always in the description below, what I've done here is I've set up 2 sections on this web page. So we have an H1, we have 2 sections. We have a blue section, that's section 1. We have a yellow section, that's section 2. Inside of each of these sections, we have 3 articles in place. There they are, 1, 2, and 3. The second article in both cases has a class of move, and it's move 1 in the case of section 1, and it's move 2 in the case of section 2. Those are the ones that have the red border around them. Okay, so that's what's going on here on this fine looking web page. And so what I might want to do here is turn on some absolute positioning magic. So let's start with move 1. And let's say that I want to set this to a position of absolute. Okay, so simply by doing that much, we take article 2 from that first section, we pull it out of the normal flow. The space that it occupied collapses. So we go right from article 1 to article 3. Article 2 happens to be sitting on top of everything that comes after it. Slides up nicely underneath. Article 2 is now sitting on top. We haven't provided a left, right, bottom, or top property, and so article 2 is just sitting where it was in the normal flow, although it's not occupying that space anymore. Okay, so now we could say something like bottom 0 and right 0. Just for fun, let's put it in the bottom right corner of the web page. Okay, so that is the web page as rendered. There it is on the page. Notice that if I made this page a little bit smaller, for example, and then scrolled down, notice that that does not follow you down the page. That would be sticky or fixed positioning. That would stay in place, thus the name sticky, thus the name fixed. Absolute just means that here on rendering, it's going to be in that bottom right corner when the page is rendered. Okay, let's do the same thing here for article number 2. I'm going to set it up with exactly the same parameters, a position of absolute, bottom of 0, and a right of 0, but I'm going to change the right 0 to left 0 so we could see it separately. There it is over on the left-hand side. Okay, so we pulled those items out of the normal flow, we stuck them down in the corners of the web page. This works because if you read through our HTML, if you read through our CSS, you will find no other position declaration declared anywhere along the way in our HTML trees. However, if we did have a position of relative declared somewhere along the way in the ancestors of article 2, we would change where these items are displaying on the web page. So let me show you an example of that. Let's say that section 1 is going to have a position of relative. Okay. So when I do that, article 2 moves. Why is that? Well, absolute positioning is going to look for anything in that tree, that HTML tree, that has a position value of other than static. So relative positioning is one example of that. And so since we have section 1 that will have a relative position on it, this article will now position itself relative to section 1. So it is now in the bottom right corner of section 1 here on the page. And if we made this screen smaller, see it stays right there at the bottom right corner of section 1, that blue area there. And if we make it bigger, Article 2 might be taller than that, and it actually hangs out over the top, okay? Whereas here in the tree for Article 2 in yellow with section 2, these are all static positioning, static positioning everywhere. Body is static, the section is static. And remember, the articles, they're siblings, so they don't have any effect on Article 2 in this case. You're looking for specifically the descendants in the family tree here. And so Article 2 is remaining in the corner down here in the bottom of the web page. So to summarize, this is what we normally do with absolute and relative positioning. Absolute positioning is great for types of applications, things like a modal window that you might want to have over top of a bunch of stuff on the web page, and it's positioned exactly where it is. So modal windows often make use of absolute positioning. Things like drag and drop functionality. You have JavaScript that powers the actual ability to move things around on the page, but the CSS behind it is absolute positioning. So the JavaScript is modifying the values of left and top and so forth as that element moves around on the web page. And that's through absolute positioning. Now, if you wanted to limit the area, if you're doing a drag and drop application and you want to limit the area where dragging and dropping is possible, you would set up a relatively positioned container inside of which you could have your absolutely positioned elements on the page that could then be dragged and dropped. And that's how you would contain those absolutely positioned elements within some sort of sandbox or some kind of area that's limited to not the entire web page where you drag and drop things anywhere you want. That is what absolute and relative positioning tend to be used for these days. Back in the old days, just to mention to you guys, way back when, in Dreamweaver days, we used to have drag and drop functionality inside of Dreamweaver. It wrote the most god-awful HTML you'd ever seen. And it was powered by absolute and relative positioning through something called DHTML, dynamic HTML. It had layer tags for Netscape, and it had div tags for Microsoft. It was a complete, total disaster. But that was some of the earliest page layouts that we had. Remember, we didn't actually have access to things like Flexbox and Grid until just the last few years. So layout has always been a hack in the history of CSS up until these last, say, like 5 or 6 years. And absolute and relative positioning are one of the ways that we did that. Don't try to lay out your whole web pages with absolute or relative positioning. It is not very responsive. It's really difficult to work with in that regard. Flexbox or Grid are much better choices for laying out entire web pages. But if you have that kind of drag and drop functionality or a modal window or other cases where you may need to take an element and move it somewhere on the page, either in a constrained area or in a whole wide area itself, absolute and relative positioning are perfect for that type of functionality. I hope you found that helpful, and I'll see you next week with another topic.